So now that you guys have watched the Simpsons MoneyBart opening, what are the two ideologies presented in the opening? Which is the dominant and which is the oppositional, and how do you know that? Some of the ways you can look at the dominant and the oppositional. The dominant, of course, is being the traditional Simpsons opening, which parodies but yet idealizes the American dream, suburbia, middle class, 2.5 kids, etc., etc. And the oppositional, of course, is when Banksy goes over to Taiwan and is providing how The Simpsons is manufactured, again, satired, parodied, but still bringing to the forefront the harsh work conditions, etc., that provide that American dream. So when we look at The Simpsons, we see the format and formula. The format is, of course, a weekly episodic sitcom, and the formula is that opening theme structure. The genre is a domestic sitcom, and the fact that it is domestic is really important when we look at the American dream and the American values as being the underlying ideology. The setting and character types, suburbia and then Taiwan, and various character types that we've seen, everything from Homer's quintessential middle class, I don't know what the best type for that is. The Tim Allen stereotype, the man cave and all of that, to the Taiwanese stereotypes that we see as well. Slant shows history of satire and social criticism. It is also legitimizing the political forms of deviance, or delegitimizing the dangerous and violence. How can you tell what slant it has? And finally, the solution. What are some of the possible interpretations of the opening? Okay, so The Simpsons is a great example of how ideology is embedded within programming. And again, ideology of Banksy is being processed and packaged and sent out via the television text. The television text itself is not ideological. It is just conduit. Okay. Moving on to cultural hegemony. So for now we're moving on to Fisk. And Fisk talks about hegemony. So there's lots of variations of hegemony, or the hegemonic. For us, we're going to talk specifically about cultural hegemony. And this is the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class, who manipulate the culture of that society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and mores, so that their imposed ruling class or worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm, i.e., the people who make media content, who make the culture, embed their ideology into that culture. And their ideology is going to be such that it is natural that there are going to be people in the higher classes who have money, and natural that there are going to be people in the lower classes who don't. And that, of course, it's common sense that if you work hard enough, you can overcome any obstacle and move from lower class to higher class, etc., etc. So these are ideologies. They're built into our television and in cultural structures, but they are created by the dominant culture, the mainstream, the upper ruling class, right? So to give you guys a little bit of a sense of the various ideologies and how they relate to each other, the dominant ideology, the mainstream ideology, is the common sense ideology, quote-unquote common sense ideology of a given culture. There's also the oppositional ideology, the people who are pushing against the dominant. These are the people who are like, for example, Black Lives Matter. Dominant ideology would be that all lives matter. And the alternative ideology would be people who belong to the dominant ideology who are incorporating the oppositional ideology. Yes, Black Lives matter, even if they're not black, even if they're not affected by racism in a very particular personal way, right? So these are your three options: dominant, oppositional, and alternative. And they work together to create a system of oppositions and fluctuation, right? Ideology is not stable, and it is always going through the hegemonic process. So the hegemonic process, as has been described by me, to me, from other people, is that we have the dominant ideology, and we have the oppositional ideology, and the dominant ideology will consume portions of the oppositional ideology and make that oppositional ideology part of the dominant. So the idea that racism is bad used to be an oppositional ideology. We now, as a general society, say that racism is bad and that is part of the dominant ideology. And that's where you can see that overlap happening. However, we still have the oppositional ideology that's like, not only racism is bad, but we should do something about it, and here are the things we should do. And that has been rejected by the dominant ideology. Now, ideally, in a wonderful world, the dominant ideology would consume all the good things of the oppositional ideology, and the dominant ideology would change. Realistically, more common is that the dominant ideology consumes the oppositional ideology, strips it of its meaning, takes the cultural forms, and spits out the ideology. Now, the core, the fundamental beliefs. An example of this for cultural processions would be like punk as a cultural movement. Punk was an oppositional ideology to the very, the word I'm looking for, classic jock, preppy, dominant ideology at the time. This is the 70s. The dominant ideology winds up consuming punk rock, punk culture. It keeps the music, it keeps the clothing, and it throws away the anarchist sentiment that had been underlying, the anarchist ideology that had been underlying punk. So now you get the look of punk, the aesthetics of punk, without the underlying ideology of down with the system, as being part of the dominant ideology. So that is sort of the two processes. Like, hegemonic is a good thing, is eventually, hopefully, it changes the dominant ideology in a real way. Hegemonic process is a bad thing. More likely, it'll strip the oppositional ideology of its visual markers, aesthetic markers, and spit out the underlying ideology and values, rendering the oppositional ideology ill-effective. Now, you'll notice that the emergent dominant ideology is in there, that overlapping area. And then we also have the residual and the residual dominant ideology. That is that we still have things that are in the dominant ideology that are from a previous time that are no longer useful to the ideology but still exist. So sexism, or that tattoos aren't something professional enough for you to wear, for you to have for work, etc. There eventually will be removed entirely from the dominant ideology, but they're still there, even if they are no longer part of the current cultural norm. Okay. So TV's hegemonic process. TV has a conventional form. You have to stick within the 30 or the 60 minutes. The homogenized programming, once you have a format and a genre, you pretty much have your basic outline of your programming, and guess what? It's pretty similar to all the other programs that are the same genre and format. That's that whole, there's 937 channels and nothing to watch, because everything looks the same, and if you don't like that thing that's the same, then there's nothing to watch, right? It's commercial production. Always means that it's going to be looking for the lowest common denominator, trying to get the largest audience available to it. Likewise, it's going to make adjustments to appeal to sponsors, etc. And so for Fisk, there is this big pushback of is it even possible for television to be oppositional? Can only be dominant ideology, dominant culture. And he spends a lot of time exploring this concept of like, okay, but here's all the ways that it's hegemonic, here's all the way that it's taking these oppositional things and putting it in a blender and sucking out all the good stuff, and leaving only the aesthetics. And he decides that no, actually, there is a few things that makes television oppositional. And his reaction here is the realism, the verisimilitude of television, the appearance of something being or feeling real, makes the TV world natural, renders the ideology as natural as common sense, and this we associate with hegemony and we associate it with the dominant ideology. However, and the example here I have is The Wire. However, there are some things that television is radical. TV's realism is mixed with the aesthetics of excess that draws attention to the illusion. So just as much as it's the verisimilitude, the feeling of being real, the excess of the visuals, of the sound, of the aesthetics, the performance and the acting being overdone, draws attention to the fact that this is in fact an illusion, it is not real, and that is radical, because it denaturalizes in a lot of ways the ideology that is constructing these commercial endeavors. Further, television refuses to have a fixed or singular spectator. They have, if it's a mass audience, it means that it's looking for men and women, it's looking for old and young, it's looking for very generalized audiences that are going to have very, very different interpretations of the text. Now, he would argue that TV is not radical and that it does not replace pleasure of recognition with pleasure of learning, but we have read Hartley and others who would argue that TV is in fact learning and that learning can be pleasurable. And so I would argue that given our background, that we could say that television is radical and that it replaces the pleasure of recognition, but instead of replacing it, it adds to it with the pleasure of learning. And finally, he says that television doesn't mix documentary and fictional genres, and at the time that Fisk was writing that was probably true. However, in our modern day, where we have the mockumentary and reality television and all sorts of genres that are hybrid between the fictional and the non-fictional, that in fact television has become even more radical than Fisk could have ever dreamed.